Chapter 9 of Ancient and Modern Celebrated Freethinkers. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Ancient and Modern Celebrated Freethinkers by Charles Bradlaugh. Chapter 9, Comte de Volney. Constantine Francis Chasseboeuf de Volney was born on February 3rd, 1757, at Craonne in Anjou. His father, a distinguished advocate, not wishing his son to bear the name of Chasseboeuf, resolved that he should assume that of Boisgirais. With this name Constantine Francis was first known in the world, studying at the College of Ancenis and Angers. He afterwards commenced his Oriental travels, changing his name to Volney. At the age of 17, finding himself his own master, and possessed of 50 francs a year inherited from his mother, he went to Paris, in order to study the sciences, preferring the study of medicine and physiology, although giving great attention to history and the ancient languages. On inheriting a legacy of 240 francs, he visited Egypt and Syria, starting on foot, a knapsack on his back, a gun on his shoulder, and his 240 francs in gold concealed in a belt. When he arrived in Egypt, he shut himself up for 8 months in a Coptic monastery, in order to learn Arabic, after which he commenced his travels through Egypt and Syria, returning to France after an absence of 4 years, and publishing his Voyage in Egypte et in Syrie, which was acknowledged by the French army, on their conquering Egypt, to be the only book that had never deceived them. The French government named him Director of Commerce and Agriculture in Corsica, but being elected a deputy of the Tiers Etat at the Seneschaux of Anjou, he resigned the government appointment, holding the maxim that a national deputy ought not in any way to be a pensioner. He opposed all secret deliberations, and wished to admit the constituents and the citizens. He was made secretary on the 23rd of November, 1790, and in the debates which arose upon the power of the king to determine peace and war, Volney proposed and carried the resolution that "the French nation renounces from this moment the undertaking of any war tending to increase their territory." In 1792 he accompanied Pazzo di Borgo to Corsica, in compliance with invitations from many influential inhabitants who sought his information. In Corsica he became acquainted with Napoleon Bonaparte, who was then an artillery officer, and some years after, hearing that Bonaparte had obtained the command of the army of Italy, Volney exclaimed, "If circumstances favor him, we shall see the head of a Caesar upon the shoulders of an Alexander." When Volney returned to Paris, he published an account of the state of Corsica. He was afterwards appointed professor of history, attracting large audiences, but the normal school being suppressed, he embarked for the United States of America in 1795. He was received by Washington, who bestowed publicly on him marks of honor and friendship. In 1798, Volney returned to France, and gave up to his mother in law the property which he was entitled to from the death of his father, which had just occurred. During his absence he had been chosen a member of the Institute. Bonaparte also, on Volney's return, tried to win his esteem and assistance, soliciting him as colleague in the consulship, but he refused the cooperation, as also the office of Minister of the Interior. Seldom do men find so many inducements to accept office as were offered to Volney, and seldom do men appear who are disinterested enough to reject the inducements then held out to him. Although he refused to work with the ruling powers of that day, he never ceased to work for the people. He occupied himself till the last year of his life in giving to the world that literature which will never be forgotten. It would be impossible to notice all the works written by such an indefatigable thinker as the heretic of our sketch. We ought to mention, however, that subsequently to his being made peer of France by Louis XVIII., and when there existed an intention of crowning Louis, Volney published the History of Samuel, the inventor of royal coronations. This book represents Samuel as an impostor, Saul as the blind instrument of sacerdotal cunning, and David as an ambitious youth. In September, 1791, Volney presented to the Assembly "The Ruins, or Meditations on the Revolutions of Empires," a book which will immortalize him in the memory of Freethinkers. The originality of style and the eloquence of expression cannot fail to interest all who read it. We give the following extracts from the above work, but as it contains so much that ought to be read, we must return to the subject in another number. Legislators, friends of evidence and of truth, that the subject of which we treat should be involved in so many clouds is by no means astonishing, since, beside the difficulties that are peculiar to it, thought itself has till this moment ever had shackles imposed upon it, and free inquiry, by the intolerance of every religious system, been interdicted. But now that thought is unrestrained, and may develop all its powers, we will expose in the face of day, and submit to the common judgment of assembled nations, such rational truths as unprejudiced minds have by long and laborious study discovered, and this, not with the design of imposing them as a creed, but from a desire of provoking new lights, and obtaining better information. Chiefs and instructors of the people, you are not ignorant of the profound obscurity in which the nature, origin, and history of the dogmas you teach are enveloped. Imposed by force and authority, inculcated by education, maintained by the influence of example, they were perpetuated from age to age, and habit and inattention strengthened their empire. But if man, enlightened by experience and reflection, summon to the bar of mature examination the prejudices of his infancy, he presently discovers a multitude of incongruities and contradictions, which awaken his sagacity, and call forth the exertion of his reasoning powers. At first, remarking the various and opposite creeds into which nations are divided, we are led boldly to reject the infallibility claimed by each, and arming ourselves alternately with their reciprocal pretensions, to conceive that the senses and the understanding emanating directly from God are a law not less sacred, and a guide not less sure, than the indirect and contradictory codes of the prophets. If we proceed to examine the texture of the codes themselves, we shall observe that their pretended divine laws, that is to say, laws immutable and eternal, have risen from the complexion of times, of places, and of persons; that these codes issue one from another in a kind of genealogical order, mutually borrowing a common and similar fund of ideas, which every institutor modifies agreeably to his fancy. If we ascend to the source of those ideas, we shall find that it is lost in the night of time, in the infancy of nations, in the very origin of the world, to which they claim alliance; and there, immersed in the obscurity of chaos and the fabulous empire of tradition, they are attended with so many prodigies as to be seemingly inaccessible to the human understanding. But this prodigious state of things gives birth to a ray of reasoning that resolves the difficulty; for if the miracles held out in systems of religion have actually existed, if for instance, metamorphoses, apparitions, and the conversations of one or more gods, recorded in the sacred books of the Hindus, the Hebrews, and the Parses, are indeed events in real history, it follows that nature in those times was perfectly unlike the nature that we are acquainted with now; that men of the present age are totally different from the men that formerly existed, but consequently that we ought not to trouble our heads about them. On the contrary, if those miraculous facts have had no real existence in the physical order of things, they must be regarded solely as productions of the human intellect; and the nature of man, at this day, capable of making the most fantastic combinations, explains the phenomenon of those monsters in history. The only difficulty is to ascertain how, and for what purpose, the imagination invented them. If we examine with attention the subjects that are exhibited by them, if we analyze the ideas which they combine and associate, and weigh with accuracy all their concomitant circumstances, we shall find a solution perfectly conformable to the laws of nature. Those fabulous stories have a figurative sense different from their apparent one. They are founded on simple and physical facts. But these facts, being ill conceived and erroneously represented, have been disfigured and changed from their original nature by accidental causes dependent on the human mind, by the confusion of signs made use of in the representation of objects, by the equivocation of words, the defect of language, and the imperfection of writing. These gods, for example, who act such singular parts in every system, are no other than the physical powers of nature, the elements, the winds, the meteors, the stars, all which have been personified by the necessary mechanism of language, and the manner in which objects are conceived by the understanding. Their life, their manners, their actions, are only the operation of the same powers, and the whole of their pretended history no more than a description of their various phenomena, traced by the first naturalist that observed them, but taken in a contrary sense by the vulgar, who did not understand it, or by succeeding generations who forgot it. In a word, all the theological dogmas respecting the origin of the world, the nature of God, the revelation of his laws, the manifestation of his person, are but recitals of astronomical facts, figurative and emblematical narratives of the motion and influence of the heavenly bodies. The very idea itself of the divinity, which is at present so obscure, abstracted, and metaphysical, was in its origin merely a composite of the powers of the material universe, considered sometimes analytically, as they appear in their agents and their phenomena, and sometimes synthetically, as forming one whole, and exhibiting an harmonious revelation in all its parts. Thus the name of God has been bestowed sometimes upon the wind, upon fire, water, and the elements, sometimes upon the sun, the stars, the planets, and their influences, sometimes upon the universe at large, and the matter of which the world is composed, sometimes upon abstract and metaphysical properties, such as space, duration, motion, and intelligence. But in every instance the idea of a deity has not flowed from the miraculous revelation of an invisible world, but has been the natural result of human reflection, has followed the progress and undergone the changes of the successive improvement of intellect, and has had for its subject the visible universe and its different agents. It is then in vain that nations refer the origin of their religion to heavenly inspiration. It is in vain that they pretend to describe a supernatural state of things as first in order of events. The original barbarous state of mankind, attested by their own monuments, belies all their assertions. These assertions are still more victoriously refuted by considering this great principle: that man receives no ideas but through the medium of his senses. For from hence it appears that every system which ascribes human wisdom to any other source than experience and sensation includes in it a hysteron vloteron, and represents the last results of understanding as earliest in the order of time. If we examine the different religious systems which have been formed respecting the actions of the gods, and the origin of the world, we shall discover at every turn an anticipation in the order of narrating things, which could only be suggested by subsequent reflection. Reason, then, emboldened by these contradictions, hesitates not to reject whatever does not accord with the nature of things, and accepts nothing for historical truth that is not capable of being established by argument and ratiocination. Its ideas and suggestions are as follows: Before any nation received from a neighbor nation dogmas already invented, before one generation inherited the ideas of another, none of these complicated systems had existence. The first men, the children of nature, whose consciousness was anterior to experience, and who brought no preconceived knowledge into the world with them, were born without any idea of those articles of faith which are the result of learned contention, of those religious rites which had relation to arts and practices not yet in existence, of those precepts which suppose the passions already developed, of those laws which have reference to a language and a social order hereafter to be produced, of that God whose attributes are abstractions of the knowledge of nature, and the idea of whose conduct is suggested by the experience of a despotic government; in fine, of that soul and those spiritual existences which are said not to be the object of the senses, but which, however, we must forever have remained unacquainted with, if our senses had not introduced them to us. Previously to arriving at these notions, an immense catalogue of existing facts must have been observed. Man, originally savage, must have learned from repeated trials the use of his organs. Successive generations must have invented and refined upon the means of subsistence, and the understanding, at liberty to disengage itself from the wants of nature, must have risen to the complicated art of comparing ideas, digesting reasonings, and seizing upon abstract similitudes. It was not till after having surmounted those obstacles, and run a long career in the night of history, that man, reflecting on his state, began to perceive his subjection to forces superior to his own, and independent of his will. The sun gave him light and warmth, fire burned, thunder terrified, the winds buffeted, water overwhelmed him. All the various natural existences acted upon him in a manner not to be resisted. For a long time an automaton, he remained passive, without inquiring into the cause of this action. But the very moment he was desirous of accounting to himself for it, astonishment seized his mind, and passing from the surprise of a first thought to the reverie of curiosity, he formed a chain of reasoning. At first, considering only the action of the elements upon him, he inferred relatively to himself an idea of weakness, of subjection, and relatively to them, an idea of power, of domination, and this idea was the primitive and fundamental type of all his conceptions of the divinity. The action of the natural existences, in the second place, excited in him sensations of pleasure or pain, of good or evil. By virtue of his organization, he conceived love or aversion for them. He desired or dreaded their presence, and fear or hope was the principle of every idea of religion. Afterwards, judging everything by comparison, and remarking in those beings a motion spontaneous like his own, he supposed there to be a will, an intelligence inherent in that motion, of a nature similar to what existed in himself, and hence, by way of inference, he started a fresh argument. Having experienced that certain modes of behavior towards his fellow creatures wrought a change in their affections and governed their conduct, he applied those practices to the powerful beings of the universe. When my fellow creature of superior strength, said he to himself, is disposed to injure me, I humble myself before him, and my prayer has the art of appeasing him. I will pray to the powerful beings that strike me. I will supplicate the faculties of the planets, the waters, and they will hear me. I will conjure them to avert calamities, and to grant me the blessings which are at their disposal. My tears will move, my offerings propitiate them, and I shall enjoy complete felicity. And, simple in the infancy of his reason, man spoke to the sun and the moon. He animated with his understanding and his passions the great agents of nature. He thought by vain sounds and useless practices to change their inflexible laws. Fatal error! He desired that the water should ascend, the mountains be removed, the stone mount in the air, and substituting a fantastic to a real world, he constituted for himself beings of opinion, to the terror of his mind and the torment of his race. Thus the ideas of God and religion sprung, like all others, from physical objects, and were, in the understanding of man, the products of his sensations, his wants, the circumstances of his life, and the progressive state of his knowledge. As these ideas had natural beings for their first models, it resulted from hence that the divinity was originally as various and manifold as the forms under which he seemed to act. Each being was a power, a genius, and the first men found the universe crowded with innumerable gods. In like manner, the ideas of the divinity having had for motors the affections of the human heart, they underwent an order of division calculated from the sensations of pain and pleasure, of love and hatred. The powers of nature, the gods, the genii, were classified into benign and maleficent, into good and evil ones, and this constitutes the universality of these two ideas in every system of religion. These ideas, analogous to the condition of their inventors, were for a long time confused and cross. Wandering in woods beset with wants, destitute of resources, men in their savage state had no leisure to make comparisons and draw conclusions. Suffering more ills than they tasted enjoyments, their most habitual sentiment was fear, their theology terror. Their worship was confined to certain modes of salutation, of offerings which they presented to beings whom they supposed to be ferocious and greedy like themselves. In their state of equality and independence, no one took upon him the office of mediator with gods as insubordinate and poor as himself. No one having any superfluity to dispose of, there existed no parasite under the name of priest, nor tribute under the name of victim, nor empire under the name of altar. Their dogmas and morality, jumbled together, were only self preservation; and their religion, an arbitrary idea without influence on the mutual relations existing between men, was but a vain homage paid to the visible powers of nature. Such was the first and necessary origin of every idea of the divinity. In reality, when the vulgar heard others talk of a new heaven and another world, they gave a body to these fictions; they erected on it a solid stage and real scenes, and their notions of geography and astronomy served to strengthen, if they did not give rise to the delusion. On the one hand, the Phoenician navigators, those who passed the Pillars of Hercules to fetch the pewter of Thule and the amber of the Baltic, related that at the extremity of the world, the boundaries of the ocean (the Mediterranean), where the sun sets to the countries of Asia, there were fortunate islands, the abode of an everlasting spring, and at a farther distance, Hyperborean regions placed under the earth, relatively to the tropics, where reigned an eternal night. From those stories, badly understood, and no doubt confusedly related, the imagination of the people composed the Elysian fields, delightful spots in a world below, having their heaven, their sun, and their stars, and Tartarus, a place of darkness, humidity, mire, and chilling frost. Now, inasmuch as mankind, inquisitive about all that of which they are ignorant, and desirous of a protracted existence, had already exerted their faculties respecting what was to become of them after death, inasmuch as they had early reasoned upon that principle of life which animates the body, and which quits it without changing the form of the body, and had conceived to themselves airy substances, phantoms and shades, they loved to believe that they should resume in the subterranean world that life which it was so painful to lose; and this abode appeared commodious for the reception of those beloved objects which they could not prevail on themselves to renounce. On the other hand, the astrological and philosophical priests told such stories of their heavens as perfectly quadrated with these fictions. Having, in their metaphorical language, denominated the equinoxes and solstices the gates of heaven, or the entrance of the seasons, they explained the terrestrial phenomena by saying, that through the gate of Horn, first the bull, afterwards the ram, vivifying fires descended, which in spring gave life to vegetation and aquatic spirits, which caused at the solstice the overflowing of the Nile; that through the gate of Ivory, originally the Bowman or Sagittarius, then the Balance, and through that of Capricorn or the Urn, the emanations or influences of the heavens returned to their source and reascended to their origin; and the Milky Way, which passed through the doors of the solstices, seemed to them to have been placed there on purpose to be their road and vehicle. The celestial scene farther presented, according to their atlas, a river, the Nile, designated by the windings of the Hydra, together with a barge, the vessel Argo, and the dog Sirius, both bearing relation to that river, of which they foreboded the overflowing. These circumstances, added to the preceding ones, increased the probability of the fiction; and thus to arrive at Tartarus or Elysium, souls were obliged to cross the rivers Styx and Acheron, in the boat of Charon the ferryman, and to pass through the doors of Horn and Ivory, which were guarded by the mastiff Cerberus. At length, a civil usage was joined to all these inventions, and gave them consistency. The inhabitants of Egypt having remarked that the putrefaction of dead bodies became in their burning climate the source of pestilence and diseases, the custom was introduced in a great number of states, of burying the dead at a distance from the inhabited districts, in the desert which lies at the west. To arrive there, it was necessary to cross the canals of the river in a boat, and pay a toll to the ferryman; otherwise the body remaining unburied would have been left a prey to wild beasts. This custom suggested to her civil and religious legislators a powerful means of affecting the manners of her inhabitants, and addressing savage and uncultivated men with the motives of filial piety and reverence for the dead. They introduced, as a necessary condition, the undergoing that previous trial which should decide whether the deceased deserved to be admitted upon the footing of his family honors into the Black City. Such an idea too well accorded with the rest of the business not to be incorporated with it. It accordingly entered for an article into religious creeds, and hell had its Minos and its Rhadamanthus, and the wand and the chair, the guards and the urn, after the exact model of this civil transaction. The divinity then for the first time became a subject of moral and political consideration, a legislator, by so much the more formidable as, while his judgment was final and his decrees without appeal, he was unapproachable to his subjects. This mythological and fabulous creation, composed as it was of scattered and discordant parts, then became a source of future punishments and rewards, in which divine justice was supposed to correct the vices and errors of this transitory state. A spiritual and mystical system, such as I have mentioned, acquired so much the more credit, as it applied itself to the mind by every argument suited to it. The oppressed looked thither for an indemnification, and entertained the consoling hope of vengeance. The oppressor expected by the costliness of his offerings to secure himself impunity, and at the same time employed this principle to inspire the vulgar with timidity. Kings and priests, the heads of the people, saw in it a new source of power, as they reserved to themselves the privilege of awarding the favors or the censure of the great judge of all, according to the opinion that they should inculcate of the odiousness of crimes and the meritoriousness of virtue. Thus, then, an invisible and imaginary world entered into competition with that which was real. Such, O Persians, was the origin of your renovated earth, your city of resurrection, placed under the equator, and distinguished from all other cities by this singular attribute, that the bodies of its inhabitants cast no shade. Such, O Jews and Christians, disciples of the Persians, was the source of your new Jerusalem, your paradise and your heaven, modeled upon the astrological heaven of Hermes. Meanwhile, your hell, O ye Mussulmans, a subterraneous pit surmounted by a bridge, your balance of souls and good works, your judgment pronounced by the angels Munkir and Nekir, derives its attributes from the mysterious ceremonies of the cave of Mithra, and your heaven is exactly coincident with that of Osiris, Ormuzd, and Brahma. It is evident that it is not truth for which you contend, that it is not her cause you are jealous of maintaining, but the cause of your own passions and prejudices; that it is not the object as it really exists that you wish to verify, but the object as it appears to you; that it is not the evidence of the thing that you are anxious should prevail, but your personal opinion, your mode of seeing and judging. There is a power that you want to exercise, an interest that you want to maintain, a prerogative that you want to assume. In short, the whole is a struggle of vanity. And as every individual, when he compares himself with every other, finds himself to be his equal and fellow, he resists by a similar feeling of right; and from this right, which you all deny to each other, and from the inherent consciousness of your equality, spring your disputes, your combats, and your intolerance. Now, the only way of restoring unanimity is by returning to nature, and taking the order of things which she has established for your director and guide; and this farther truth will then appear from your uniformity of sentiment. If we would arrive at uniformity of opinion, we must previously establish certainty, and verify the resemblance which our ideas have to their models. Now, this cannot be obtained except so far as the objects of our inquiry can be referred to the testimony, and subjected to the examination of our senses. Whatever cannot be brought to this trial is beyond the limits of our understanding. We have neither rule to try it by, nor measure by which to institute a comparison, nor source of demonstration and knowledge concerning it. Whence it is obvious that, in order to live in peace and harmony, we must consent not to pronounce upon such objects, nor annex to them importance. We must draw a line of demarcation between such as can be verified and such as cannot, and separate by an inviolable barrier the world of fantastic beings from the world of realities. That is to say, all civil effect must be taken away from theological and religious opinions. This, O nations, is the end that a great people, freed from their fetters and prejudices, have proposed to themselves. This is the work in which, by their command and under their immediate auspices, we were engaged when your kings and your priests came to interrupt our labors. Kings and priests, you may yet for a while suspend the solemn publication of the laws of nature, but it is no longer in your power to annihilate or to subvert them. We conclude with the following: investigate the laws which nature, for our direction, has implanted in our breasts, and form from thence an authentic and immutable code. Nor let this code be calculated for one family or one nation only, but for the whole, without exception. Be the legislators of the human race, as ye are the interpreters of their common nature. Show us the line that separates the world of chimeras from that of reality, and each of us, after so many religions of error and delusion, the religion of evidence and truth. Our space prohibits further quotation in this number, but when we return to the subject we shall notice chapter 21, Problem of Religious Contradictions, and also the Law of Nature, or Principles of Morality. Few men wrote more on various topics than Volney, and few have been more respected while living, and esteemed when dead, by those whose respect and esteem it is always an honor to possess. At the age of 53, after much travel and great study, Volney consoled his latter days by marrying his cousin, the hope of his youth, Mademoiselle de Chassebeuf. A disorder of the bladder, contracted when traversing the Arabian deserts, caused his death at the age of 63. He was buried in the cemetery of Père Lachaise, while Laya, director of the French Academy, pronounced a noble panegyric over his grave; and months after his death he was spoken highly of by some of the most illustrious men of France. Thus ended the days of one of the Freethinkers of the past, whose works, despite all suppression, will never die. End of chapter 9. Recorded by Ted Delorme in Fort Mill, South Carolina. Chapter 10 of Ancient and Modern Celebrated Freethinkers. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Ancient and Modern Celebrated Freethinkers by Charles Bradlaugh. Chapter 10. Charles Blount. Look with me through the dark vista of 150 years of clouded history. Throw your mind across the bridge of time, for we are about to visit a tragic scene, a scene which might be depicted by a poet, so much of beauty, of truth, and of goodness, all blasted by the perjuries of the priest. Yonder, in the dim library of an ancestral mansion, embowered amid the woods of the South, close by the gurgling waters which beat an echo to the stormy breezes, those breezes which will never more fan his cheek. That water where he has often bathed his limbs will be his rippling monument. The shady moonlight of an August evening is gilding the rich pastures of Hertfordshire. The gorse bushes have not yet lost their beauty. The pheasants are playing in the woods, woods that so lately resounded with laughter. Laughter ringing like a bell, the music of a merry heart. Withdraw those curtains which hide the heart struck and the dead. Above you is the exquisite picture of Eleanora, gazing into the very bed at that form which lay shrouded in nothingness. You see the broad, manly brow. Even now the brown hair rises in graceful curls over that damp forehead. The lips are locked in an eternal smile, as if to mock the closed eyes and the recumbent form. Is it true that pictures of those we love are endowed with a clairvoyant power of gazing at those who have caressed them in life? If it is, then on that August night the wife of Charles Blount was watching over his bier. But who is that pale form, with disheveled hair and weeping eyes, with an alabaster skin stained with the blue spots of grief? The rapid upheaving swells of that fair bosom tell of affection withered, not by remorse, but by superstition. See here how she nervously grasps that dead man's hand, how she imprints kisses on his lips. Her hair, which yesterday was glossy as the raven's, is now as bleached as the driven snow. Today she utters her plaintive cries. Tomorrow she hastens to join her lover in the tomb. This is a sad history. It should be written with the juice of hemlock, as a warning to genius of impatient love. While the fair girl watches by the couch of the suicide, while from the painted canvas Eleanora gleams on the living and the dead, while the clouds of night gather silently over that ancestral hall, around the drooping combs on the bold sloping park, and the clear blue river, all so quiet and gentle, let us gather up the events of the past, and learn the cause of a death so tragic, a grief so piercing. In the year 1672, at the age of 19 years, a young man, the son of a baronet, led to the altar the lovely daughter of Sir Timothy Tyrrell. Flowers strewed the path of the wedded pair, and for years their life was one scene of bliss. At last, struck down by disease, Charles Blount stood by the side of his dying wife. In his arms his Eleanora yielded her last sigh. He buried her by the willow tree in the old churchyard. The lily blended with the white rose, and the myrtle overshadowed the grave. It was here where the widower rested in the evening, here where he taught his children the virtues of their dead mother. Sometimes he gazed at the azure skies, and strange fancies beguiled the mind of the mourner. When he saw the sun sink to the west, gilding the world with its glorious rays, he mused on the creeds of many lands. He fancied he saw a heaven and a God, and traced in the lines of light the patriarchal worshippers of the world. He looked at the sun and its worshippers, those who sought the origin of purity by worshipping that which is the origin of all good. He looked at the fables of Greece, and found delight in the thought of Sappho uttering her diapason of joy in lyrics which told of love and beauty; at Egypt, where the priests, in their esoteric cunning, searched in vain for that which gives life, and motion, and joy; and then he glanced at the Christian heaven, but here all was dark, dark as the Plutonian caverns of Homer's hell. He wished to meet his Eleonora, not in pagan dreams, not in Christian parables, but in the world of realities. He looked with eager eyes upon the world around him, in society, at court, and in the homes of his country; but wherever he went there was but one thought, one feeling. He wished a mother for his children, a mother like the sainted dead. There was but one who answered the ideal, like in features, in passion, and in beauty, to the lost Eleonora. Born of the same parents, loved by the same brother, educated by the same teachers, imbued with the same thoughts, she was the model of her dead sister. With a sisterly love for her brother, she was already both mother and aunt to her sister's children. With deliberate thoughts, with convulsive passion, the love of Charles Blount passed the bounds of that of a brother. Longing to make her his wife, he adored her with the passion he had lavished on the dead. It seemed as if the shade of Eleonora was perpetually prompting him to bestow all his affection on the young and beautiful Eliza. She caressed his children with the pride of an aunt. She traced the image of her sister in the laughing eyes of the merry babes. Still she was not happy. How could she be happy? She loved him as a man, as a brother. She was a Christian, he an infidel. She was bound by creeds, he by conduct. She was doing the duty she owed to the dead. He sought to do it by uniting himself to the living. Eliza was anxious to marry, but there existed something which, to her mind, was greater than human duties, and it often outraged them. God and the Church demanded her first attention, and then her lover and his children. The Church, in cruel mockery of human rights, stepped between her judgment and her affections. It denied the power of a woman to occupy the married home of her deceased sister. She was willing to pledge her love to Charles Blount at the altar, but the priest mocked her prayers, and denounced her affections. The occasion was too good to be lost. Episcopalism sought revenge on its opponent, and it triumphed. Eliza felt the force of Blount's arguments. She wandered with him through the green fields, but her sorrow was too great to pluck the wild roses. The luscious fruits of summer were passed untasted. A heart sick and in trouble, a mind wandering from her sister's grave to her children, and then at the anathema of the Church, made her a widowed maid. To overcome her scruples, her lover wrote a book, inviting the clergy to refute it, defending the marriage with a deceased wife's sister. But ever as he spoke, there was a film before her eyes. There was a gaunt priest, with canonical robes, stood before the gates of heaven. Before him and through him was the way to an eternal happiness. Below him was a fiery hell, and he shouted with hoarse voice, "Incest! Incest! Incest!" And ever as he shouted, he pointed with his finger of scorn at this Christian hell, and she conjured up in her mind the old stories of this priest, until she saw the livid flames rising up higher, till they encircled her form, And then the priest screamed with fury, "Anathema Maranatha! Incest! Incest!" And in terror she stood, with the big drops of sweat dripping from her brow, with her heart beating, with her mind distracted, but her affections unclouded. The priest was the Church of England, and those fancies were driven into her imagination by her creed, her litanies, and her sermons. Eliza Tyrrell was miserable. She was placed between her love, her duty, and her religion. If she had been a woman of a strong mind, she would have torn her creed into shreds. She would have dared the anathema of the priest, the ostracism of its dupes, and would have clung to the man she loved so truly, in defiance of that which was, at the best, but a faint possibility. The arguments in that pamphlet of Blount's were conclusive, but she distrusted reason. The plainest dictates of common logic were referred to the promptings of the devil. How could it be otherwise? Can the teachings of a lifetime be overthrown by the courtship of a few months? Eliza Tyrrell, true to Blount, loved him. True to her religion, she durst not marry him without the sanction of the Church. So Blount, as a last resolve, laid the matter before the Lords Vicegerent at Canterbury, and many of those most learned divines of England. And from those ecclesiastical leeches there was a Shylock cry of incest, incest, incest. And those terrible words came greeting the ears of Charles Blount, making his home like a charnel house, and they nearly sent his beautiful Eliza to a maniac's grave. Still she lingered on. Denied the power of a wife, she would not relinquish her duties as a mother to her sister's babes. There was a calm heroism here which few can imitate. The passions of Blount could not brook further insults. The last kick of bigotry against the broken-hearted Freethinker was given. He could no longer rise with the lark, and roam over the hills of his ancestral home. To him the birds, as they warbled, spoke of joys never to return. The broad river told him of the days when the little skiff floated on its waters with Eleanora, and even his friends only too bitterly reminded him of the tournaments of wit, where Hobbes, Brown, and Gildon jousted each other in the presence of his wife. His life was one scene of misery. He saw no chance of amendment. In a fit of despair, he loaded his pistol with due deliberation, placed it to his head, and shot himself. He lingered for some time, and then died on the breast of Eliza. This was a strange suicide. Blount's memory bears its weight of obloquy. It is hard to draw the line when and where a man has a right to take away his life. Common sense tells us that so long as our families are dependent on us, we have no right to end our lives. And if we have no dependents, no friends, then our country has a claim upon us. But at the same time, the one sole end of existence is to be happy. If a man cannot find happiness in life, if there is a great coalition against him, he is justified in taking up arms against them. But at the same time, it proves a greater amount of courage to bear up against the ills of life than to madly leave it, and thus weaken the force of those who wish to stem its injustice. Charles Blount died, and with him expired much of the chivalry of Freethought. His friend Charles Gildon, writing of him to a lady, says, "You know Austria, Eliza, and have an exact friendship with her. You can attest her beauty, wit, honor, virtue, good humor, and discretion. You have been acquainted with the charms of her conversation and conduct, and condemn her only adhering to a national custom to the loss of so generous a friend and so faithful a lover. but custom and obedience meeting the more easily, betrayed her virtue into a crime. I know my friend loved her to his last breath, and I know, therefore, that all who love his memory must, for her sake, love and value her, as being a lady of that merit, that engaged the reason of Philander (Charles Blount) to so violent a passion for her. The same writer says, his father was Sir Henry Blount, the Socrates of the age, for his aversions to the reigning sophisms and hypocrisies, eminent in all capacities; the best husband, father, and master, extremely agreeable in conversation, and just in all his dealings. From such a father our hero derived himself, to such a master owed his generous education, unmixed with the nauseous methods and profane opinions of the schools. Nature gave him parts capable of the noblest sciences, and his industrious studies bore a proportion to his capacities. He was a generous and constant friend, an indulgent parent, and a kind master. His temper was open and free, his conversation pleasant, his reflections just and modest, his repartees close, not scurrilous. He had a great deal of wit, and no malice. His mind was large and noble, above the little designs of most men, an enemy to dissimulation, and never feared to own his thoughts. He was a true Englishman, and lover of the liberties of his country, and declared it in the worst of times. He was an enemy to nothing but error, and none were his enemies that knew him, but those who sacrificed more to mammon than reason. This was the man who died, because a dominant priesthood insisted on a dogma which interfered with a purely secular right, which blasted two hearts in a vain attempt to perpetuate a system which dashes its rude fingers, and tears out the heart of human felicity, to sprinkle the altar of superstition with the gore of offended innocence. Charles Blount was a deist. As such, he believed in a God, which he described in his account of a deist religion. Let us examine his thoughts, and see if they bear the interpretation which Christianity has always placed upon them. Blount gives the deist's opinion of God. He says, whatever is adorable, amiable, and imitable by mankind, is in one supreme, perfect being. An atheist cannot object to this. He speaks in the manner in which God is to be worshipped. He says, not by sacrifice or by a mediator, but by a steady adherence to all that is great and good and imitable in nature. This is the brief religious creed of Charles Blount. He never seeks to find out fabled attributes of deity. He knows what is of value to mankind, and sedulously practices whatever is beneficial to society. In his Anima Mundi, or History of the Opinions of the Heathens on the Immortality of the Soul, page 97, Blount says, the heathen philosophers were much divided concerning the soul's future state. Some held it mortal, others immortal. Of those who held the mortality of the soul, the Epicureans were the chief sect, who, notwithstanding their doctrines, led virtuous lives. Cardan had so great a value for their moral actions, that he appeared in justification of them. It appears, says he, by the writings of Cicero, Diogenes, and Laertius, that the Epicureans did more religiously observe laws, piety, and fidelity among men than either the Stoics or the Platonists. And I suppose the cause thereof was, that a man is either good or evil by custom, but none confideth in those that do not possess sanctity of life. Wherefore they were compelled to use greater fidelity, thereby the better to justify their profession, from which reason it likewise proceeds. that at this day few do equal the fidelity of usurers, notwithstanding that they are most base in the rest of their life. Also among the Jews, whilst the Pharisees that confessed the resurrection and the immortality of the soul frequently persecuted Christ, the Sadducees, who denied the resurrection, angels, and spirits, meddled not with him above once or twice, and that very gently. Thus, if you compare the lives of Pliny and Seneca, not their writings, you shall find Pliny with his mortality of the soul did as far exceed Seneca in honesty of manners, as Seneca excels him in religious discourse. The Epicureans observed honesty above others, and in their conversation were usually found inoffensive and virtuous, and for that reason were often employed by the Romans when they could persuade them to accept of great employs. For their fault was not any want of ability or honesty, but their general desire of leading a private life of ease, and free from trouble, although inglorious. For when immortality is not owned, there can be no ambition of posthumous glory. The Epicureans, instead of those bloody scenes of gallantry which tyrants applaud, undertook to maintain carefully the inheritance of orphans, bringing up at their own charge the children of their deceased friends, and were counted good men, unless it were in front of religious worship. For they constantly affirmed that there were no gods, or at least such as concerned themselves with human affairs, according to the poets. Neither doth the hope of immortality conduce to fortitude, as some vainly suggest, for Brutus was not more valiant than Cassius, and if we will confess the truth, the deeds of Brutus were more cruel than those of Cassius, for he used the Rhodians, who were his enemies, far more kindly than Brutus did those amicable cities which he governed. In a word, though they both had a hand in Caesar's murder, yet Brutus was the only parricide. So that the Stoics, which believed a providence, lived as if there were none, whereas the Epicureans, who denied it, lived as if there were. The next sect to the Epicureans in point of incredulity concerning the soul, I conceive to be the Skeptics, who were by some esteemed not only the modestest, but the most perspicuous of all sects. They neither affirmed nor denied anything, but doubted of all things. They thought all our knowledge seemed rather like truth than to be really true, and that for such like reasons as these. 1. They denied any knowledge of the divine nature, because they say, to know adequately is to comprehend, and to comprehend is to contain, and the thing contained must be less than that which contains it. To know inadequately is not to know. 2. From the uncertainty of our senses, as, for instance, our eyes represent things at a distance to be less than they really are. A straight stick in the water appears crooked, the moon to be no bigger than a cheese, the sun greater at rising and setting than at noon. The shore seems to move, and the ship to stand still. Square things to be round at a distance, an erect pillar to be less at the top. Neither, say they, do we know whether objects are really as our eyes represent them to us, for the same thing which seems white to us seems yellow to a jaundiced man, and red to a creature afflicted with red eyes. Also, if a man rubs his eyes, the figure which he beholds seems long or narrow, and therefore it is not improbable that goats, cats, and other creatures which have long pupils of the eye may think those things long which we call round. For as glasses represent the object variously, according to their shape, so it may be with our eyes. And so the sense of hearing deceives. Thus the echo of a trumpet sounded in a valley makes the sound seem before us, when it is behind us. Besides, how can we think that an ear, which has a narrow passage, can receive the same sound with that which has a wide one? Or the ear, whose inside is full of hair, to hear the same with a smooth ear? Experience tells us that if we stop or half stop our ears, the sound cometh different as when the ears are open; nor is the smelling, taste, or touch less subject to mistake; for the same scents please some, and displease others, and so in our tastes. To a rough and dry tongue, that very thing seems bitter as in an ague, which to the most moist tongue seems otherwise, and so it is in other creatures. The like is true of the touch, for it were absurd to think that those creatures which are covered with shells, scales, or hairs, should have the same sense in touching with those that are smooth. Thus, one and the same object is diversely judged of according to the various qualities of the instruments of sense, which convinceth to the imagination. From all which the skeptic concluded, that what these things are in their own nature, whether red, white, bitter, or sweet, he cannot tell. For, says he, why should I prefer my own conceit, in affirming the nature of things to be thus or thus, because it seemeth so to me, when other living creatures perhaps think it is otherwise? But the greatest fallacy is in the operation of our inward senses; for the fancy is sometimes persuaded that it hears and sees what it does not; and our reasoning is so weak, that in many disciplines scarce one demonstration is found, though this alone produces science. Wherefore it was Democritus's opinion that truth is hid in a well, that she may not be found by men. Now, although this doctrine be very inconsistent with Christianity, yet I could wish Adam had been of this persuasion, for then he would not have mortgaged his posterity for the purchase of a twilight knowledge. Now, from these sinister observations it was that they esteemed all our sciences to be but conjectures, and our knowledge but opinion. Whereupon, doubting the sufficiency of human reason, they would not venture to affirm or deny anything of the soul's future state, but civilly and quietly gave way to the doctrines and ordinances under which they lived, without raising or espousing any new opinions. Speaking of the origin of the world, Gildon gives the following as a translation from Ocellus Lucanus: "Again, says he, as the frame of the world has been always, so it is necessary that its parts should likewise always have existed. By parts I mean the heaven, earth, and that which lieth betwixt, viz., the sky, for not without these, but with these, and of these, the world consists. Also, if the parts exist, it is necessary that the things which are within them should also coexist, as with the heavens, the sun, moon, fixed stars, and planets, with the earth, animals, plants, minerals, gold and silver, with the air, exhalations, winds, and the alterations of weather, sometimes heat and sometimes cold. For with the world all those things do and ever have existed, as parts thereof. Nor hath man had any original production from the earth, or elsewhere, as some believe, but have always been, as now he is, coexistent with the world, whereof he is a part. Now corruptions and violent alterations are made, according to the parts of the earth, by winds and waters imprisoned in the bowels thereof; but a universal corruption of the earth never hath been, nor ever shall be. Yet these alterations have given occasion for the invention of many lies and fables. And thus are we to understand them that derive the original of the Greek history from Inachus the Argive, Not that he really was the original, as some make him, but because a most memorable alteration did then happen, and some were so unskilful as to attribute it to Inachus. But for the universe, and all the parts whereof it subsists, as it is at present, so it ever was, and ever shall be, one nature perpetually moving, and another perpetually suffering; one always governing, and the other always being governed. The course which nature takes in governing the world is by one contrary prevailing over another, as thus: the moisture in the air prevaileth over the dryness of the fire, and the coldness of the wafer over the heat of the air, and the dryness of the earth over the moisture of the water, and so the moisture of the water over the dryness of the earth, and the heat in the air over the coldness in the water, and the dryness in the fire over the moisture of the air. And thus the alterations are made and produced out of one another. As nature cannot create by making something out of nothing, so neither can it annihilate by turning something into nothing. Whence it consequently follows, as there is no access, so there is no diminution in the universe, no more than in the alphabet, by the infinite combination and transposition of letters, or in the wax by the alteration of the seals stamped upon it. Now, as for the forms of natural bodies, no sooner doth any one abandon the matter he occupied, but another instantly steps into the place thereof. No sooner hath one acted his part and is retired, but another comes presently forth upon the stage, though it may be in a different shape, and so act a different part; so that no portion of the matter is, or at any time can be, altogether void and empty; but, like Proteus, it burns itself into 1,000 shapes, and is always supplied with one form or another, there being in nature nothing but circulation. The following are the principal works of Blount: Anima Mundi, or an historical narration of the opinions of the ancients concerning man's soul after this life, according to enlightened nature, published in 1679. Upwards of 20 answers were published to this work. In 1680 he published a translation, with notes, of the life of Apollonius of Tyana. This work was suppressed. During the same year he gave the world "Great is Diana of the Ephesians, or the Original of Idolatry." By able critics this is considered one of his ablest works. In 1683 Religio Laici appeared, which is published in a Latin work of Lord Herbert's. In 1688 he wrote "A Vindication of Learning, and of the Liberty of the Press." This tractate sparkles with wit and argument; but by far the most important work he was connected with was published in the year he died, and mainly written by himself: "The Oracles of Reason," a favorite title with both American and English Freethinkers. It consists of 16 sections, the most interesting being the first 4, containing a vindication of Dr. Burnet's archaeology. The 7th and 8th chapters, translated, of the same, of Moses's description of the original state of man, and Dr. Burnet's appendix of the Brahmin's religion. We would quote from these sections of the Oracles, but intend to form separate half hours with sketches of Drs. Brown and Burnet. It will be more appropriate to use Blount's translation in describing those quaint but highly instructive authors. In the general style of Blount's works he is not seen to advantage. There is too much heaviness, enhanced by the perpetual Greek and Latin quotations. But as his works were intended for scholars, and the time in which they were written was essentially the most pedantic era of our literary history, we cannot expect that vivacity and clearness which other writers in a later age possessed. It was in his character as a man that Blount excelled. He was the leader of the chivalry of the period, as in the next age Woolston was his successor. At the court he was the gayest of the gay, without the taint of immorality, in a period of the grossest licentiousness. He defended the honor of his friends, frequently at the expense of calumny and danger. In witty repartees he was equal to Rochester, while for abstruse learning he was superior to many of the most learned theologians. Daintily brave and skilfully alive to the requirements of friends and foes, he passed through life in the gilded barge of pleasure, and ended it sailing through a cloud where he foundered. But the darkness which enveloped his history is now charged with that sympathetic power which draws the young to his grave, and compels the gloomiest to shed a tear over his unhappy fate. At the close of August, in 1693, a few friends met near the grave of Blount to join in their last respects to their lost friend. Foremost among them was Charles Gildon, who so soon repented of the part he had taken in the oracles of reason, but never forgot the kindness he experienced from Blount. He lived long enough for Pope to be revenged on his apostasy, by inserting his name in his great satire. At the time we speak he was mournful and deeply grieved at the loss he had sustained. Near him was Harvey Wilwood, whose bold demeanor and sorrowful countenance told of heart-struck grief; for of the few able to appreciate the genius of Blount, he was one of the earliest and most devoted in his friendship. Now we see the noble lord whom Blount always addressed as the most ingenious Strephon. Along with him there is the pretty Anne Rogers, with Savage and Major Arkwright. We look in vain for Eliza Tyrrell. They talk slowly over him that is no more. They recount to themselves the intellectual achievements and the brilliant hours they have spent in the past, and while they speak so kindly and think so deeply, they kneel on the hallowed spot, but not to pray. Some of them pledge their enmity against Christian laws and Christian priests, and they executed it. During this time, the calm radiance of the lunar light shines on the church of Ridge, illumining those ghostly tablets of white marble, where the forefathers of Blount lie entombed. The baronial arms are emblazoned on the wall, heraldic pomp is keeping watch over the mouldering bones of the now leveled grate. Anne Rogers weeps wildly for Eliza and Eleanora. Those metaphysical disquisitions which have exalted woman to so high a nature, that devotion to aesthetics which women should always cultivate, not as a household slave, but as one of equal rights with a man, and his leader in everything which concerns taste, elegance, and modesty. Such gifts in no ordinary degree had Anne Rogers, and often in dialectic subtlety had she mastered her relative, who stood by her side, and given tokens of her admiration of Blount's philosophy and conduct. Strephon was passionately attached to his confidant and friend, and could not give so calm an expression to his loss. He wept wildly, for he had lost one who tempered his rebuke with a kind word, and pointed out that Epicurean path which leads to enjoyment without excess, to pleasure without a reaction. It was a memorable meeting. While the remembrance of past deeds of love lighted up the eye, and made the blood course faster through their veins, Anne Rogers detailed the following episode in his character. Blount had visited the court of King James, and had been singled out by that monarch for one of his savage fits of spleen. "I hear, Mr. Blount, that you are very tenacious of the opinions of Sir Henry, your father, and you consider his conduct during the rebellion as worthy of imitation. Is it so?" "Your Majesty," replies Blount, "has been correctly informed. I admire my father's conduct." "What," says James, "in opposing his king?" Blount quickly answered, "A king, my liege, is the chief magistrate of the commonwealth. and is so hereditarily, while he obeys the laws of that commonwealth, whose power he represents. But when he usurps the direction of that power, he is king no longer, and such was the case with your royal father." With a scowl of defiance on his face, King James left the Freethinker, and sought more congenial company. And as Anne Rogers told the story, each eye was dimmed with tears. The moon had risen high in the heavens ere the mourners prepared to depart. The first streaks of dawn broke through the eastern sky, and revealed the grave watered with tears, where the most chivalrous Freethinker of his age reposed, in that sleep which knows of no awakening. End of chapter 10. Read for you by Ted DeLorme in Fort Mill, South Carolina. Chapter 11 of Ancient and Modern Celebrated Freethinkers. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Ancient and Modern Celebrated Freethinkers by Charles Bradlaugh. Chapter 11. Percy Bysshe Shelley. Percy Bysshe Shelley, the son and heir of a wealthy English baronet, Sir Timothy Shelley, of Castle Goring, in the county of Sussex, was born at Field Place, near Horsham, in that county, on the 4th of August, 1792. Ushered into the world in the midst of wealth and fashion, with all the advantages of family distinction, the future of Shelley's life appeared a bright one. But the sunshine of the morning only served to render the darkness which came over his noontide more dark, and to make poor Shelley still more susceptible of the hardships he had to encounter. First educated at Eton, his spirit there manifested itself by an unflinching opposition to the fagging system, and by revolt against the severe discipline of the school. In his Revolt of Islam, Shelley has thus portrayed this feeling: "I do remember well the hour which burst my spirit's sleep. A fresh May dawn it was when I walked forth upon the glittering grass, and wept, I knew not why, until there rose from the near schoolroom voices that, alas, were but one echo from a world of woes, the harsh and grating strife of tyrants and of foes. And then I clasped my hands and looked around, and none was near to mock my streaming eyes, which poured their warm drops on the sunny ground. So without shame I spake, I will be wise, and just, and free, and mild, if in me lies such power, for I grow weary to behold the selfish and the strong still tyrannize without reproach or check. And from that hour did I with earnest thought heap knowledge from forbidden mines of lore, yet nothing that ray tyrants knew or taught I cared to learn, but from that secret store wrought linked armor for my soul, before it might walk forth to war among mankind." From Eton, Shelley went to Oxford, and while there he, scarce at the age of 18, published a volume of political rhymes, entitled Margaret Nicholson's Remains, the said Margaret being a woman who tried to assassinate George III. He also wrote a pamphlet in defense of atheism. A copy of this pamphlet he caused to be sent to the head of each of the colleges in Oxford, with a challenge to discuss and answer. The answer to this was the edict which expelled Shelley from Oxford, and at the same time placed a wide chasm between him and his family. This breach was still further widened in the following year, by his marriage at the age of 19 with a beautiful girl named Westbrook. Although Miss Westbrook was respectfully connected, Shelley's aristocratic family regarded this as a mésalliance, and withdrew his pecuniary allowance; and had it not been for the bride's father, who allowed the young couple £200 a year, they would have been reduced to actual poverty. This was an unfortunate marriage for both. After having 2 children, disagreements arose, and Shelley was separated from his wife. She, like all beautiful women, was soon attacked by the busy tongue of slander, and, unable to bear the world's taunts, committed suicide by throwing herself into a pond, just 4 years from the date of their marriage. Shelley, on this account, suffered much misery and misrepresentation, and this misery was much increased by his family, who applied to the Court of Chancery, and obtained a decree by which Shelley was deprived of the custody of his children, on the ground of his atheism. The same spirit even now pervades the Shelley family, and scarce a copy of his poems can be found in the neighborhood of his birthplace. Shelley afterwards contracted a second marriage with the daughter of Godwin, the author of Caleb Williams, and Mary Wollstonecraft, who died in giving birth to Shelley's wife; and for some time the poet resided at Marlow in Buckinghamshire, where he composed the Revolt of Islam; and it is a strong proof of the reality of Shelley's poetical pleadings for the oppressed amongst the human race, that he was indefatigable in his attentions to the poor cottagers of his neighborhood, and that he suffered severely from an attack of ophthalmia, which was originated in one of his benevolent visits. Nearly the first of Shelley's poems was his Queen Mab, in which, having in vain struggled to devote himself to metaphysics apart from poetry, he blended his metaphysical speculation with his poetical aspirations. The following quotations are taken from that poem, in which his wonderful command of language is well shown. There's not one atom of yon earth but once was living man, nor the minutest drop of rain that hangeth in its thinnest cloud but flowed in human veins. And from the burning plains, where Libyan monsters yell, from the most gloomy glens of Greenland's sunless clime, to where the golden fields of fertile England spread their harvest to the day, thou canst not find one spot whereon no city stood. How strange is human pride! I tell thee that those living things, to whom the fragile blade of grass that springeth in the morn, and perishes ere noon, in an unbounded world, I tell thee that those viewless beings, whose mansion is the smallest particle of the impassive atmosphere, think, feel, and live like man, that their affections and antipathies, like his, produce the laws ruling their mortal state, and the minutest throb, that through their frame diffuses the slightest, faintest motion, is fixed and indispensable as the majestic laws that rule yon rolling orbs. How bold the flight of passion's wandering wing! How swift the step of reason's firmer tread! How calm and sweet the victories of life! How terrorless the triumph of the grave! How powerless were the mightiest monarch's arm, vain his loud threat, and impotent his frown! How ludicrous the priest's dogmatic roar, the weight of his exterminating curse, how light, and his affected charity, to suit the pressure of the changing times, what palpable deceit! But for thy aid, religion, but for thee, prolific fiend, who peoplest earth with demons, hell with men, and heaven with slaves. Thou taintest all thou look'st upon. The stair which on thy cradle beamed so brightly sweet were gods to the distempered playfulness of thy untutored infancy. The trees, the grass, the clouds, the mountains, and the sea, all living things that walk, swim, creep, or fly, were gods.
The sun had homage, and the moon her worshipper. Then thou becamest a boy, more daring in thy frenzies, every shape, monstrous or vast, or beautifully wild, which from sensation's relics fancy culls. The spirits of the air, the shuddering ghost, the genii of the elements, the powers that give a shape to nature's varied works, had life and place in the corrupted belief of thy blind heart. Yet still thy youthful hands were pure of human blood. Then manhood gave its strength and ardor to thy frenzied brain. Thine eager gaze scanned the stupendous scene, whose wonders mocked the knowledge of thy pride. Their everlasting and unchanging laws reproached thine ignorance. Awhile thou stoodst, baffled and gloomy. Then thou didst sum up the elements of all that thou didst know. The changing seasons, winter's leafless reign, the budding of the heaven-breathing trees, the eternal orbs that beautify the night, the sunrise and the setting of the moon, earthquakes and wars and poison and disease and all their causes to an abstract point converging, thou didst bend and called it God, the self-sufficing, the omnipotent, the merciful, and the avenging God, who, prototype of human misrule, sits high in heaven's realm, upon a golden throne, even like an earthly king, and whose dread work hell gapes forever for the unhappy slaves of fate, whom he created in his sport to triumph in their torments when they fell. Earth heard the name. Earth trembled as the smoke of his revenge ascended up to heaven, blotting the constellations, and the cries of millions butchered in sweet confidence and unsuspecting peace, even when the bonds of safety were confirmed by wordy oaths. Sworn in his dreadful name, rung through the land, whilst innocent babes writhed on thy stubborn spear, and thou didst laugh to hear the mother's shriek of maniac gladness, as the sacred steel felt cold in her torn entrails. Religion! Thou wert then in manhood's prime, but age crept on. One God would not suffice for senile puerility. Thou framedst a tale to suit thy dotage, and to glut thy misery-thirsting soul, that the mad fiend thy wickedness had pictured might afford a plea for sating the unnatural thirst, for murder, rapine, violence, and crime that still consumed thy being, even when thou heardst the step of fate, that flames might light thy funeral scene, and the shrill horrent shrieks of parents dying on the pile that burned to light their children to thy paths. The roar of the encircling flames, the exulting cries of thine apostles, loud commingling there, might sate thy hungry ear, even on the bed of death. But now contempt is mocking thy gray hairs. Thou art descending to the darksome grave, unhonored and unpitied, but by those whose pride is passing by like thine, and sheds, like thine, a glare that fades before the sun of truth, and shines but in the dreadful night that long has lowered above the ruined world. Speaking of the atheist's martyrdom in answer to the spirit of Ianthe, Shelley makes his fairy say,
"There is no God. Nature confirms the faith his death-groan sealed. Let heaven and earth, let man's revolving race, his ceaseless generations tell their tale. Let every part, depending on the chain that links it to the whole, point to the hand that grasps its term. Let every seed that falls in silent eloquence unfold its store of argument. Infinity within, infinity without, belie creation. The exterminate spirit it contains is nature's only God. But human pride is skillful to invent most serious names to hide its ignorance. The name of God has fenced about all crime with holiness, himself the creature and his worshippers, whose names and attributes and passions change. Seva, Buddha, Fo, Jehovah, Goa, or Lord, even with the human dupes who build his shrines, still serving o'er the war-polluted world, for desolation's watchword, whether hosts stain his death-blushing chariot wheels, as on triumphantly they roll, whilst Brahmins raise a sacred hymn to mingle with the groans, or countless partners of his powers divide his tyranny to weakness, or the smoke of burning towns, the cries of female helplessness, unarmed old age, and youth and infancy, horribly massacred, ascend to heaven in honor of his name, or last and worst, earth groans beneath religion's iron age, and priests dare babble of a God of peace, even whilst their hands are red with guiltless blood, murdering the while, uprooting every germ of truth, exterminating, spoiling all, making the earth a slaughterhouse.
Ianthe's spirit, however, asks still further, and the ghost of Ahasuerus having been summoned, the question is repeated: Is there a God? Ahasuerus, is there a God? Aye, an almighty God, and vengeful as almighty. Once his voice was heard on earth. Earth shuddered at the sound. The fiery visaged firmament expressed abhorrence, and the grave of nature yawned to swallow all the dauntless and the good that dared to hurl defiance at his throne, girt as it was with power. None but slaves survived, cold-blooded slaves, who did the work of tyrannous omnipotence, whose souls no honest indignation ever urged to elevated daring, to one deed which gross and sensual self did not pollute. These slaves built temples for the omnipotent fiend, gorgeous and vast. The costly altars smoked with human blood, and hideous moans rung through all the long-drawn aisles. A murderer heard his voice in Egypt, one whose gifts and arts had raised him to his eminence in power, accomplice of omnipotence in crime, and confidant of the all-knowing one. These were Jehovah's words. From an eternity of idleness God awoke. In 7 days toil made earth from nothing, rested and created man. I placed him in a paradise, and there planted the tree of evil, so that he might eat and perish, and my soul procure wherewith to sate its malice, and to turn, even like a heartless conqueror of the earth, all misery to my fame. The race of men chosen to my honor with impunity may sate the lusts I planted in their heart. Here I command thee hence to lead them on, until, with hardened feet, their conquering troops wade on the promised soil through woman's blood, and make my name be dreaded through the land. Yet ever burning flame and ceaseless woe shall be the doom of their eternal souls. With every soul on this ungrateful earth, virtuous or vicious, weak or strong, even all shall perish, to fulfill the blind revenge which you, to men, call justice of their God. The murderer's brow quivered with horror. God omnipotent, is there no mercy? Must our punishment be endless?
Will long ages roll away and see no term? Oh, wherefore hast thou made in mockery and wrath this evil earth? Mercy becomes the powerful. Be but just, O God, repent and save. One way remains. I will beget a son, and he shall bear the sins of all the world. He shall arise in an unnoticed corner of the earth, and there shall die upon a cross, and purge the universal crime, so that the few on whom my grace descends, those who are marked as vessels to the honor of their God, may credit this strange sacrifice, and save their souls alive. Millions shall live and die who ne'er shall call upon their Saviour's name, but, unredeemed, go to the gaping grave. Thousands shall deem it an old woman's tale, such as the nurses frighten babes withal. These, in a gulf of anguish and of flame, shall curse their reprobation endlessly. Yet tenfold pangs shall force them to avow, even on their beds of torment where they howl, my honor and the justice of their doom. What then avail their virtuous deeds, their thoughts of purity, with radiant genius bright, or lit with human reason's earthly ray? Many are called, but few I will elect. Do thou my bidding, Moses. In his poem of Rosalind and Helen, the poet indulges in the following prophecy, which he puts in the mouth of Helen:
Fear not, the tyrants shall rule forever, or the priests of the bloody faith. They stand on the brink of that mighty river, whose waves they have tainted with death. It is fed from the depths of 1,000 dells. Around them it foams, and rages, and swells, and their swords and their scepters I floating see, like wrecks on the surge of eternity.
Beside the poems mentioned, Shelley wrote The Cenci, Alastor, Prometheus Unbound, and many others, including a beautiful little ode to a skylark, and the well-known Sensitive Plant. Shelley was a true and noble man. No poet was ever warmed by a more genuine and unforced aspiration. De Quincey says, Shelley would, from his earliest manhood, have sacrificed all that he possessed for any comprehensive purpose of good for the race of man. He dismissed all insults and injuries from his memory. He was the sincerest and most truthful of human creatures. If he denounced marriage as a vicious institution, that was but another phase of the partial lunacy which affected him. For to no man were purity and fidelity more essential elements in the idea of real love. Again, De Quincey speaks of Shelley's fearlessness, his gracious nature, his truth, his purity from all fleshliness of appetite, his freedom from vanity, his diffusive love and tenderness. This testimony is worth much, the more especially when we remember that it is from the pen of Thomas De Quincey, who, while truthfully acknowledging the man, hesitates not to use polished irony, rough wit, and covert sneering, when dealing with the man's uttered thinkings. That Shelley understood the true mission of a poet and the true nature of poetry will appear from the following extract from one of his prose essays. Poetry, he says, is the record of the best and happiest moments of the happiest and best minds. We are aware of evanescent visitations of thought and feeling, sometimes associated with place and person, sometimes regarding our own mind alone, and always arising unforeseen and departing unbidden, but elevating study delightful beyond all expression. Poets are not only subject to these experiences, as spirits of the most refined organization, but they can color all they combine with the evanescent lines of this ethereal world. A word, a trait in the representation of a scene or passion, will touch the enchanted chord, and reanimate in those who have ever experienced these emotions the sleeping, the cold, the buried image of the past. Poetry thus makes immortal all that is best and most beautiful in the world. It arrests the vanishing apparitions which haunt the interlunations of life, and veiling them, or in language or in form, sends them forth among mankind, bearing sweet news of kindred joy to those with whom their sisters abide. Abide, because there is no portal of expression from the caverns of the spirit which they inhabit into the universe of things. Shelley's beautiful imagery and idealistic drapery is sometimes so accumulated in his poems that it is difficult to follow him in his thinkings. In his verse he wishes to stand high as a philosophical reasoner, and this, together with his devotion to the cause, which even men of De Quincey's stamp call insolent infidelity, has prevented Shelley from becoming so popular as he might have been. Shelley lived a life of strife, passed his boyhood and youth in struggling to be free, misunderstood and misinterpreted, and when at last, in his manhood, happier circumstances were gathering around him, a blast of wind came, and the waves of the sea washed away one who was really and truly a man and a poet. On Monday, July 8th, 1822, being then in his 29th year, Shelley was returning from Leghorn to his home at Lerici, in a schooner rigged boat of his own, with one friend and an English servant. When the boat had reached about 4 miles from the shore, the storm suddenly rose, and the wind suddenly shifted. From excessive smoothness, all at once the sea was foaming and breaking, and getting up in a heavy swell. The boat is supposed to have filled to leeward, and Carrien's 2 tons of ballast to have sunk instantaneously. All on board were drowned. The body of Shelley was washed on shore 8 days afterwards, near Viareggio, in an advanced state of decomposition, and was therefore burned on a funeral pyre in the presence of Leigh Hunt, Lord Byron, Mr. Trelawney, and a Captain Shenley. Thus died Shelley, in the mid-day of life, and ere the warm sun of that mid-day could dispel the clouds that had gathered round the morning of his career. The following comparison, made between the personal appearance of Shelley and of Byron by Gilfillan, has been called by De Quincey an eloquent parallel, and we therefore conclude the present number by quoting it. In the forehead and head of Byron there is more massive power and breadth. Shelley has a smooth, arched, spiritual expression. Wrinkle there seems none on his brow. It is as if perpetual youth had there dropped its freshness. Byron's eye seems the focus of pride and lust. Shelley's is mild, pensive, fixed on you, but seeing you through the mist of his own idealism. Defiance curls on Byron's nostril, and sensuality steps his full, large lips. The lower features of Shelley's face are frail, feminine, flexible. Byron's head is turned upwards, as if, having risen proudly above his contemporaries, he were daring to claim kindred, or demand a contest with a superior order of beings. Shelley's is half bent, in reverence and humility, before some vast vision seen by his own eye alone. Misery erect and striving to cover its retreat under an aspect of contemptuous fury, is the permanent and pervading expression of Byron's countenance. Sorrow, softened and shadened away by hope and habit, lies like a holier day of still moonshine upon that of Shelley. In the portrait of Byron, taken at the age of 19, you see the unnatural age of premature passion. His hair is young, his dress is youthful, but his face is old. In Shelley you see the eternal child, none the less that his hair is gray, and that sorrow seems half his immortality. End of chapter 11 of Ancient and Modern Celebrated Freethinkers by Charles Bradlaugh. Read for you by Ted DeLorme in Fort Mill, South Carolina.